Okay. Well, hello everyone. I'm happy that you all made it. It's quite a crowd for
Hi.
our second meeting of our conference on women and power and royal women in power in Hellenistic monarchy. Um, Last time, for those of you who couldn't make it last time, Sheila Ager and Alex Macaulay um, introduced us to the topic that we are going to discuss during the next 8 meetings between 2021 and 2022. They tried to build a constructive framework and they meant to offer ground to move beyond the basic misogynistic and non-misogynistic, misogynist and non-misogynist approach, juxtaposition. So they tried, Alex Macaulay tried to draw the attention to the vocabulary that was used by when talking and describing women and power in the ancient Mediterranean. So where this vocabulary came from and where it led to. Sheila, in particular, also tried to define the quality and quantity of the power of royal women, when this power was influence, when authority, when control. And I think that one question really, I think, attracted our attention, and it was, how can we measure this power? Is it the abundance of evidence? Is it a sign of abundance of power? So you can find, if you want to, I think there is a mic. Yeah. So if you're interested in picking up what was said, you can find the materials from last times. You can find the papers online on the Waterloo website, and you can find, I'm sorry, I apologize for that, only a partial recording because we pressed the start button at the halfway through. This time instead we started right away. So now we go with our first guest. Our first guest, I'm sure that all of you know her because of her work. It's Elizabeth Carney. She's an emerita at Clemson University. She's worked there for a long time. Her groundbreaking book on women and monarchy in Macedonia that was published in the 2000 changed the field for all of us and many others. And it was followed by many articles on politics and monarchy in Macedonia and beyond. She wrote books on several ancient royal women. I'm just going to mention Arsinoe of Egypt, Olympias, and also Eurydice. That was her 2019 volume on the birth of Macedonian power. Her most recent volume, I think, is The Rutledge Companion to Women and Monarchy in the Ancient Mediterranean, that she co-edited with Sabine Müller, that I see is here today too. So I'm very happy about that. So now the floor is yours, Beth.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to be reading, and having not heard Alex's paper because I was busy being the mother of the bride, I did hear Sheila's. Forgive me if I overlap, but what I'm about to talk about seems to me something I should have done every time I thought about the career of an individual royal woman, and I did not. So it's kind of, the evidence will determine how much you can figure out. But so, complicating the agency of royal women. A cloud of others surrounded royal women, but it's hard to see that crowd now, and thus easy to underestimate the contributions many people made to the agency of individual royal women. The ability of royal women to act could be shaped by or depend upon that of their own staff, allies foreign and domestic, military forces, and the action or inaction, presence or absence of family members. Extant sources rarely refer to the existence of women's staff, let alone name them. Similarly, the family members, even those at a great distance, enabled some royal women to act independently and prevented others from doing so. Our narratives may not directly tell us. We must instead deduce their action or inaction. I want to recognize the choices that individuals or groups made at various levels in the power structure to assist or to prevent the agency of assorted royal women. My examples are taken from the early Hellenistic period, because, you know, guys, that's what I know about. Situations differed naturally with period and dynasty, but my examples are, I think, suggestive. I'll begin with a general discussion and conclude with a reconsideration of the agency of Sinani and Adi Eurydice. It's often difficult to determine the status of the serving royal women. Justin refers to two women who accompany Olympias as Ankylae, a word that usually refers to female slaves. Similarly, he describes two women who fled with Arsinoe as Servulae, another word often used about enslaved women. Justin's diction, of course, may simply reflect his own presuppositions. Diodorus says that the attempt of Cleopatra, sister of Alexander, to escape the control of Antigonus' governor in Sardis and flee to Ptolemy led to his governor, on his orders, having Gunakes murder her, and then in turn had some of them killed so that he could claim that they did it, not he. Diodorus' diction doesn't specify the possibly mixed status of these women. Male and female members of the elite also form part of the households of royal women. According to a speech in Curtius attributed to Midas, son of Andromedes, Olympia sheltered in her household many young men, avoiding military service, but Amyntas forced them to serve. Curtius names three of them in this group. They are usually assumed to be members of the future members of the Basilica Hyades. Later, when Cassander besieged Olympias at Pydna, Diodorus specifies that Alexander IV and Roxanne, Thessalonice, Deidamia, Iacides' daughter and the possible fiancée of Alexander IV, the daughters of Attalus, many Attalus possible, accompanied her, as well as relatives of Olympias' most distinguished friends. Diodorus criticizes her for having so many people around her, not useful in war. But this criticism presupposes that she knew she was going to be besieged from the beginning. Moreover, her grandson, Roxanne, Thessalonice, and Deidamia, would probably not have been safe much of anywhere else, and it's turned out not there. Olympia's real problem was that she lacked sustained military protection, and that not that she had courtiers. One wonders if Diodorus / Hieronymus was really criticizing her for acting like a king and having a largish court. In 316 or 315, that was probably exceptional, though it soon would not be, and maybe should be understood as a sign of the kind of public persona she wanted to generate. Elite males served royal women in advisory and military capacities. Polyperchon offered Olympias a position in charge of her grandson. Eumenes gave her advice. At the beginning of the siege of Pydna, Olympias appointed as her strategos Arisnos, one of the bodyguards of Alexander, later a supporter of Perdiccas, and later yet of Polyperchon. He took charge of the remaining troops loyal to the Argead house, and when Olympias surrendered, she ordered him to do so as well. Eurydice, once married to Philip Aridaeus, tried via stump speeches to woo the army in Asia away from the control of the male commanders and regents. Diodorus and Arrian both refer to a man called Asclepiodoros, described as Grammateus' secretary, who aided in her efforts. He could have been a prominent member of the Macedonian elite or simply a secretary, but probably not a slave. Arrian also mentions a certain Attalus as assisting in this effort. He was most likely a member of the elite. After the home army abandoned Eurydice for Olympias in 317, she was captured along with a man named Polycles, whom Diodorus describes as one of her counselors, Symboloi. And again, what his status was is hard to say, but probably fairly high. What did the staff do apart from domestic tasks and giving advice and support of various kinds? Many must have served as messengers for the apparently extensive correspondence carried on by royal women. But these same people, as well as others, may have gathered information and intelligence. Royal women needed information to advantage and protect themselves, and they often managed to acquire it even when, thanks to Alexander's conquest and the development of the Hellenistic dynasties, the desired information was pretty far away. Olympias seemed knowledgeable about happenings in Asia throughout Alexander's reign, often advising him on people or matters happening at court. Her ability to acquire information may, however, have waned after Alexander's death. Poor intelligence about Asian events and about the deterioration of her interest in the Greek peninsula, not simply wishful thinking, though there was probably that too, could have been a factor in her defeat and death. Of course, once under siege at Pydna, she could hardly know about Eumenes' equally perilous situation in Asia, ignorance that may have contributed to her subsequent decisions. The social rank of human sources of information probably varied. Some were likely members of the elite. For instance, officers returning to Macedonia with veterans could have served as sources. Artists and actors, because they traveled for competition and commissions, provided information and acted as agents for male royals and may well have done so for women too. Cleopatra erected a tomb for a Samian flute player who could have provided more than musical entertainment. Olympias offered so generously to send Alexander a slave for him to buy, one who was skilled at various rituals, but perhaps he had intelligent skills too that Olympias hoped to use. Arsinoe funded the Arsinoeum at Samothrace. The artists she patronized there and later elsewhere could also have acted as her agents since they, like actors, traveled. Allies and enemies could empower or betray royal women. Olympias and Antipater became enemies apparently early in Alexander's reign, a fact that weakened her position enough that she felt compelled to leave Macedonia. Though later in Alexander's reign, her continuing enmity with Antipater empowered her. Eurydice formed some sort of alliance with Cassander. Since she was married to Philip Aridaeus at the time, Cassander could not have been hoping, at least really quickly, for marriage, but for women of marriageable age, allies were often suitors. Diodorus famously claims that all Alexander's generals, and he enumerates a few, at one point or another negotiated to marry Cleopatra. Soon after Alexander's death, Cleopatra, still in Macedonia, proffered herself in marriage to Leonatus, whom Antipater had already offered a daughter, a fact that may have prompted Cleopatra's negotiations. Leonatus was in Asia Minor at the time, though he died at Lamia soon after returning to the Greek peninsula. Then she entered negotiations with Perdiccas, who was in Asia. Again, she was doubtless aware that Antipater had already sent a daughter to him. Cleopatra likely had advocates and opponents in the courts of various successors, particularly in the years before the death of Antipater in 319, when Cleopatra and Antipater's daughters functioned as rival brides for political alliances. After the death of Perdiccas, Antipater scolded Cleopatra for her philia with Perdiccas and Eumenes, though in the latter's case, we don't know that there had been marriage discussions with him. Much later, as we heard a moment ago, she was long under the control of Antigonus at Sardis until she had a falling out with him. But Diodorus' diction implies that initially they'd been, if not allies, then not enemies. And then, of course, she tried to escape, presumably to marry Ptolemy. Military support often proved critical for the exercise of agency. That support could involve members of the elite, allies like Aristonus and Polyperchon or Cassander. Troops could enable women to act. Sinani took military forces with her, which enabled her to escape Antipater and reach Asia. Regular troops or mercenaries sometimes helped, but could destroy them. Both things happened to Olympias, really. Polyaenus implies that naval forces stayed loyal to Arsinoe too, enabling her to escape from Sardis after Lysimachus' death. The lack of long-term control of significant military forces was a chronic problem for royal women and a serious limit on their agency, granted that only Sinani is said to have engaged in combat, though a number of women appeared in front of armies and gave speeches to soldiers. Families were critical to the agency of royal women. Kin could provide or withhold military support. Justin tells us that two offended royal wives, Olympias and Stratonice, I won't say which Cilician she is, but she was the one married to Demetrius too, tried and failed to persuade their kin to attack an offending husband. Neither story may be true. This could be a kind of topos of Justin. Still, these two passages demonstrate how limited the agency of women was because of their inability to directly lead military forces. On the other hand, Olympias' nephew Eacides, king of Molossia, twice tried to give her military aid. Later in the Hellenistic period, women did, through generals, command forces. Moreover, granted, the Ptolemaic kings didn't go into battle and employed generals themselves, as did royal women. At least for that dynasty, the distinction disappeared. Fathers, sons, or brothers usually decided whom royal women would marry. And granted, the women in general in the Greek world didn't get to choose their mates. This lack of choice wasn't distinctive. But since royal marriages often involved alliances with foreign powers at a distance, the birth family wasn't close. Sabina Mueller has argued that this was a critical factor in limiting Roxanne's career. On the other hand, Barsini spent many years safely with her son by Alexander in Pergamum, near her family's traditional seat of power, but likely gave up that security to support her son's claim to his father's throne. In so doing, lost her life. The Ptolemaic pattern of brother-sister marriage tended to mean that Ptolemaic women were not as isolated as royal daughters in other dynasties. The fate of Berenice Pernephoros demonstrates how dangerous foreign marriage could be, but sibling marriage could render one's close kin just as dangerous, witness Berenice III. The inaction or action of family members could also make non-military initiatives for royal women possible or not. Our sources sometimes make this phenomenon explicit. More often they imply it. Olympias almost certainly killed Philip's last wife, Cleopatra. Plutarch asserts that Alexander was angry with his mother for having treated Cleopatra savagely, presumably euphemism, But whether or not Alexander was angry with her or complicit, he did not kill Olympias, as she was doubtless sure he would not. According to Hyperides, the Athenians associated Olympias and Alexander, assuming some sort of common policy or point of view. Throughout the Asian campaign, Olympias wrote Alexander. It may be true that he kept her letters secret. She was his informant and likely on and off a useful one. Though early in the Asian campaign, Alexander allowed Antipater to win his struggles with Olympias, Plutarch recounts that later Alexander was suspiciously tolerant of her feud with Antipater, supposedly allowing her and his sister to divide Macedonia and Molossia between them. Olympias and Cleopatra, apart from probably ruling Molossia during the period, were able to exercise considerable freedom of action because Alexander, within limits, did not prevent them from doing so and indirectly encouraged them, probably as a counterweight to Antipater, with whom he was increasingly unhappy. The actions of Olympias and Cleopatra in the period immediately after Alexander's death indicate they knew they were no longer able to enjoy that freedom of action, that they weren't safe. Cleopatra suddenly got interested in remarrying. Olympias remained in Molossia despite Polyperchon's invitations to return to Macedonia. When she did venture to involve herself in succession politics, Polyperchon proved a slender reed, and Cassandra was able to kill her. Cleopatra, as we've heard, passed into the control of Antigonus. And the fates of Sinani and her daughter Ada Eurydice were thinly sealed because they too lacked functional male supportive ones anyway. Arsinoe too was both protected and endangered by her family. After her arrival at the court of Lysimachus, she and her sons became embroiled in a succession struggle with her husband's son, Agathocles. Lysimachus let this rivalry brew, arguably encouraged it for some years. Agathocles was killed in the end, whether by Arsinoe's agency or that of Lysimachus. After her husband's death, Arsinoe returned to Macedonia and controlled a portion of it, but was persuaded to marry her half-brother Ptolemy Ceraunus, by then king of Macedonia, over the objections of her eldest son. Ceraunus then promptly killed her younger sons, but allowed her to flee to Samothrace and, of course, ultimately Egypt. Her brother Ptolemy, too, had not rushed to defend her cause in Macedonia after Lysimachus' death, but surely Ceraunus didn't kill her because he was concerned that Ptolemy, too, would act if he did. Now let me focus on Sinani, Alexander's half-sister, and her daughter, Ada Eurydice. Their circumstances and actions look different when one thinks of them not simply as plucky individuals, though they were, but also in the context of a faction, one going back to Midas, son of Perdiccas, Philip II's nephew. As an infant or toddler, Amyntas may nominally and briefly have been king, but Philip II was quickly recognized as the ruler. Towards the end of his reign, Philip arranged the marriage of Sinani, his daughter by his Illyrian wife Adada, to his nephew Amyntas. By this point, Philip was planning the Asian expedition and yet had only one viable son. His son Ardes was understood to have mental limitations of some sort. Likely, Philip intended Amyntas to be the backup heir. After Philip's assassination, Macedonia was in turmoil, and Alexander apparently executed Amyntas and some of the sons of Europus, justly or not, for plotting against him. Soon after, Alexander tried to arrange Sinani's remarriage to an ally of his, but the prospective groom died, and she remained a widow, supposedly because she wanted to. Sinani taught her daughter the arts of war, as she had apparently been previously taught herself. Her situation and that of her daughter changed after the death of Alexander, when the army in Babylon forced the officers to accept Alexander's half-brother, now called Philip III, Ardes, as king. Sinani escaped from Macedonia to Asia, after the death of Alexander in company with her daughter, granted that she planned to marry her daughter to Philip Arrhidaeus, Sinani must have been aware that the army had forced the elite to recognize him as king. Perhaps, I would say likely, seeing the event as a model for her own ambitions. She would certainly have been familiar with her half-brother's limitations, whatever exactly they were. Sinani, as we have noted, utilized a military force to defeat 2 attempts by Antipater to stop her in Asia. Perdiccas' faction did, but the Macedonian army, outraged by the murder of Philip's daughter, forced through the marriage of Adi Eurydice to Philip Arrhidaeus. Granted her daughter's subsequent near success with the army, Sinani must have had information about the mood and the views of the soldiers, and probably some elite support. Adi Eurydice, though likely in her early teens at the time of her mother's death, regularly spoke to the army in Asia, nearly succeeding in winning control of them away from the generals and Antipater. However natural a public speaker she may have been, and however useful her mother's earlier training, the advice of Esclavidoras must have been critical to her remarkable speech-making effects. After Antipater finally ended her Asian-speaking career and brought her and her husband, along with a young co-king, back to the Greek peninsula, she could do little, but the death of Antipater made possible the last and most dramatic part of her career. How she managed to get to Macedonia with her husband, but without Polycarpon, who would replace Antipater as regent, is unclear, although I bet it took more than 2 of them. But it must have required advice and support. Once there, she took effective control of the kingdom and made an alliance with Cassander, son of Antipater. When Cassander was out of the country, concerned about the imminent return of Olympias, Adi Eurydice sent a messenger to Cassander asking for immediate assistance, but also by means of gifts and big promises to the most prominent Macedonians, tried to make them loyal. She marched out an army against one led by Polycarpon and Eacides on behalf of Olympias and Olympias' grandson. The Macedonian army went over to Olympias. Philip Arrhidaeus was captured immediately, and Adi Eurydice and her advisor Polycles soon after. And of course, Olympias had them both killed. So between 323 and 317, the daughter of Philip and widow of Amyntas Perdica, and her daughter, the wife of Philip III Arrhidaeus, retained support, if intermittent, from various members of the Macedonian elite and from regular troops. The support was not enough, for a variety of reasons, to keep them alive, but it demonstrates how embedded they were within the Macedonian elite and within the power structure, how relatively well connected they were with them and wider elements in armies and populations. They were supported by a faction, probably not one friendly to new practices or half-Asian heirs. Thrilled though the Macedonian army may have been to see Olympias again after all those years, the important truth is that while Olympias appeared in support of a young male heir, even if half-Asian, Adi Eurydice had no son, though she'd been married nearly 5 years. She and her mother got as far as they did because they were not just risk-taking individuals, but leaders or figureheads, depending on your point of view, of a faction or factions. The decade after Adi Eurydice's death saw the institutionalization of the entourages of royal women. So by 305, Phila has officials in her employ, and Phila, daughter of Seleucus Nicodor and wife of Antigonus Gonatas, had officials who reported to her. Royal Philoi, sometimes Philoi, both husbands and wives, became institutionalized. And Seleucid and Ptolemaic lands sometimes increased the possibility of female agency, but obviously it could narrow it. I think it's too soon to say about Antigonan women. Thinking about women's agency in the context of the actions of others makes one newly aware of how much monarchy depended on a host of differently placed actors, many not part of a ruling dynasty. Thanks.
Thank you, Beth, for this very interesting talk and a very new perspective. I'm happy that I'm happy that the themes that this conference is bringing about are I'm finding fertile grounds also with your studies. For those of you who were not here last time, we managed these question time, this Q&A through the chat. So if you have any question that you would like to ask Beth, you can write it in the chat. I can give you, I will call you and ask you to explain your point or to make your point, or I can read the question for you. So I was wondering if anyone wants to go ahead and do you have any of you has any question to ask right now? You can just write it. Like last time we started and then there were like 1,000 questions. If not, I can open the floor. I thought it was very interesting, the connection, like most of the evidence you brought were mainly connected, of course, with the military aspect, because I think our sources is what they're most interested into. But I thought it was so stimulating the artistic side of it, and also then the novel. So the artistic side, the thinking of they could they could exploit their mecenatism activity, also to use these people as informants because they could travel. That was very stimulating. I don't know, do you have any further thought on it, or you can?
It's a fine line between moving into historical fiction, which is tempting, and asking yourself, well, how did that happen? How did that get done? And then who could have done it? And I think occasionally we may actually get to know at some point, but just simply saying, even if we don't know who did it and what their rank was, that various things that happen, Eurydice's appearance with her husband in Macedonia being one of them, that had to involve a lot of people, makes you stop thinking about them in a way just as contextless individuals. And I think that's important. And especially in some places, I am hopeful that inscriptions, like some nice things on gravestones for faithful service, for instance, might help a bit with that. But still, even if it stays anonymous, it's an important thing to think through.
Yes. Yeah, I agree on that. I was thinking also about like Phila. Some of the inscriptions are actually mentioning people that were, addressing the queen because they were cooperating with her, and they don't really specify how. And yes, thank you. So I have more questions here. I have a question for Sheila. Sheila, do you want to make your point, explain us your point?
Sure. Maybe try and clarify, because trying to write it in there, I kept erasing it and then writing again, and erasing it and writing again, so that's why it took so long to get there. So I may not have made my point, and of course, since it's a question, I may also not be sure what my point is. But I was actually just really interested in what you said about the court, because it seems to me that when one contemplates power, one contemplates support and followers and so on. And of course, members of one's court can also be agents of someone else, which is sort of the downside of having a court. But that was really interesting what you said about the possibility that Diodorus might have been being critical of Olympias for having a largish court. And I just wonder about the distinction between the masculine and the feminine on this front. And I'm going to defer to Alex now too, because I think Alex might want to add to this because he had a similar question.
Yeah, it was just interesting, especially, you know, initially when you mentioned the kind of retinue and the kind of followers that some of these royal women had. I think based on Rolf Strootman's work, we can expect, especially mid-Hellenistic queens, to have a pretty substantial entourage of some Trofoi and women that they grew up with, and similarly women. But I wonder if the issue for Diodorus is the fact that you essentially have a female royal who seems to be acting at the head of a male royal court. You know, it's almost within kind of the realm of female or female spheres of action, that's okay. But whenever they start to do things in the male realm, that this becomes a little bit scandalous, perhaps.
We don't know how rapidly it changed either. I mean, I really think, because most of the evidence comes from when things are rather more tied down. I think it changed probably pretty quickly. And the problem for Olympias may be that she's a source of change, but at the same time, upsetting in a number of ways, but that's one of them.
Yeah. I have a question from Lloyd. Lloyd, do you want to talk to us?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Hi, Liz. Great to see you. Thank you for that. It was fascinating. I mean, just on this idea of the female court, really. I mean, in the Achaemenid period, we have so much rich evidence actually for the male entourage of queens, and in fact, conspicuous by their absence are other women. And so we have very high representatives as stewards, estate managers, messengers, provisions bearers, all of this kind of stuff, which really gets down to the nitty-gritty of a female court society. And if I remember correctly as well, we have some from late period Egypt as well, where men dominate female courts. So while I would agree, you know, that there are going to be, as we get, you know, with Charmian and Iris and so forth, these ladies in waiting and the circle of women that operate within the circle. I still think on the whole, we should be looking for a male structure to the court, which operates around the queen as well, which perhaps at least blurs the edges a little of that dissatisfaction or concern we have that Alex and Sheila brought up there. Maybe that's a way to think about it.
Yeah, that I agree. It's the most, if nothing else, it gives you a sense for the complex mechanics involved. Human mechanics, other kinds too,
yeah,
in moving royal people around and getting things done.
Yeah. And I wonder, you know, what we don't have the evidence for yet in Iran or in the Hellenistic world is the kind of things we see happen frequently in, courts like China, Japan, and Europe, where we have lots more information on this, of women coming into those royal circles, the circles of women, through their relationships to the men within the court as well, obviously. So, you know, some queen's steward, his wife will be part of that entourage, or his daughter will be brought in. You know, so that's the circle within circles that we can't get a hold of yet. But I think you can bet your bottom dollar that's all that's going on as well.
I agree.
What made me think, like Alex is making here a point, sorry, Alex, that said, I wonder where retinue or entourage ends and a court begins. I was thinking the same. So we should probably imagine like a court that was actually kind of following the queen or being with the queen, as Beth said, with Olympias, and then a network and actually like people that were out on the ground that were interacting with the queen, and they were bonded in some ways to her family, via like the mecenatism that we were saying before, but even like diplomatic contacts, as we saw with Phila, with the inscriptions, like people on the floor, on the ground, talking to her. Sheila, do you want to ask the second question? Alex, do you want to expand on this, or do you have other
No, that's fine. I just think from a terminological perspective, it's pretty interesting that we might call a group of 15 people a retinue in one place, and then in another
Yeah.
place it would be a full-on court. Right?
Yes. Beth, do you want to say something? Or I have a question from Sheila and one from Andrea.
Yeah, but go ahead. I'm interested thinking about fleshing things out that way.
Okay.
I'm just, again, as with one of those things that we probably just cannot know, right? So this is all just speculation, but given male-female dynamics and the tendency, not just in the ancient world, for males to be seen as guardians and protectors of females, I wonder whether having a large body of male courtiers for a queen, I just wonder whether at times it was actually constraining, that there is this protective hedge or barrier around her that, maybe saves her from her own,
Kind of like a chaperone, Sheila, almost like.
Well, sort of, something like that.
Political chaperones, kind of.
But there is something like that, isn't there? In that we find male courtiers undertaking finances, for instance.
Yes.
Because what woman could possibly cope with her own finances? So we get all this time. We get quite a lot of evidence from that in the Seleucids, under the Seleucids, don't we? In Babylonia and so forth. That there's only one way that land estates can be looked after, and that's by a male steward, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Well, and they go outside too, right? They go out and they deal with that rough world out there.
Precisely. Yeah.
I have to talk to give the word to Andrea Gatsky because she has a question to a point on this.
I think Andrea said that her voice wasn't working today.
Sorry, so I'm gonna read it.
Help her out with that, yeah.
I think it might be hard to argue for a Persian style court for Olympias, though as opposed to later Hellenistic and especially Seleucid queens, where the Persian influence is much deeper. No, I don't have a voice today, so I can't elaborate verbally, so sorry. Okay, that's it.
Perhaps that's aimed at me a little bit. I wasn't aiming to say that this Persian court was a model for the early Hellenistic period, but what I am saying is the more we can think cross-culturally and cross-chronologically for these kind of questions, the better understanding we get. We could have harked back to the Assyrian court or even forward to the Byzantine court, where we can find similar models. And I, as Jeroen Dunedam does, that's what I would love to see us do more and more in ancient history.
Yeah, and especially because we must consider that they were next to each other in this period. And they were very close contact. So I wouldn't assume that there were courtiers that were traveling in between those courts. That's it. No, I don't see any other question. Anyone else that wants to say something? Elizabeth, Beth, do you want to say something else? Or
I have one. Really, as I was writing the paper, I started thinking about this more and more. To me, one of the most important developments in ancient scholarship in the last generation or so has been to do with slavery and noticing the people our sources don't think are important to tell us about, but enable things to happen, are critical to the economy. It's tricky, and obviously people have varied about how important we consider things to be that they aren't talking about directly. But I think the same interrogating of the sources we've got, particularly granted what we know about their social status and cultural presuppositions, not just Lloyd's point about looking at it cross-culturally, because certainly Persian influence would be important more later, but Artabazus and his family hung around in Philip's court for 10 years? And that's hardly the only Persian influence on pre-Alexander Macedonian. God knows what Olympias family, how they ran things and what they got up to, but not letting our sources dictate the way we think about things, using them as evidence, but not letting their voices shape the way we think, I think is really important. And I could be wrong about every single specific I brought up here, but I think it's a really helpful thing to say to yourself, even though it's extremely subjective. Like, you know, Justin, I'm sorry. And if I were doing a musical production of ancient history, there'd be a chorus, kick line, I'm sure. Every once in a while, coming across the stage with versions of Blame It on Plutarch. I mean, I know someone who's a joke, Kent Rigsby, used to say that the ancient world had been invented by two monks named Cicero and Plutarch in the Middle Ages. But I'm serious, Plutarch is a terrible problem for understanding a lot of things that happened, and yet he's so insidiously convincing. Anyway,
Yeah.
I do think that just this general idea is something we need to keep saying to ourselves, because they make choices about what they even want to talk about or not.
And we all really loved Plutarch, and actually, like, he inspired theater like plays, so like there is a reason. Anyway, so thank you, Beth. Thank you for your talk and your generosity in answering all of the questions. I'm now gonna move to our second speaker of today's episode. She is Caitlin Gillespie. She's an assistant professor of classical studies at Brandeis University, and she's the author of a book on Queen Boudica that I'm sure you all know because she's in the book series of Women in Antiquity, the Oxford University Press book series, where Beth is also. Beth's books are also published, and she wrote many articles on the Julio-Claudian women. She's currently working on a book on women's movement in Tacitus Annals, and now the floor is hers, and she's going to, well, why can't I see? Can you see her? Can I see you?
Can you see me?
Okay, now I can see you. So the floor is all yours, and she's gonna talk to us about Agrippina today, right?
Amazing. Thank you so much. Can you allow me to share a screen or someone? Thank you, Sheila.
Okay, this is where we go through the little awkward steps of getting the technology to, do what we want it to do. So hang on. Nope, I don't want to share my screen. Stop that. I want to allow others to share. So I think, Caitlin, you ought to be able to share your screen.
Amazing. Okay, let's try
Okay.
it. Do we see something
There you-
called Agrippina's arrogant fecundity?
Yes.
There we
Yes,
go.
we do.
All right. Magical. Let me know if it stops working at any time. But otherwise, let's get started. We are going into the Roman period, so we're going to be jumping ahead a little bit in this talk. And I look forward to all of your comments. I've really enjoyed the discussion so far. So let's just dive into it. I wanted to return at the beginning to something we talked about last time, just for a minute, that the idea of power, in maybe very large scare quotes, at its very basis implies a hierarchy, right? There are those who have it and those who have it, those who they wield power over, perhaps. And in what I want to do today, I want to talk about power hierarchies that are established by successful mothers. I'm working with a concept that, at least in part, the source and measure of a queen's power lies in her biological ability to produce royal heirs. And that might be very obvious, but I'd like to think about it a little bit more carefully. That a woman's success is demonstrable in the number and the sex of the children she produces. More is better, males are better, and the survival of multiple children places her higher up on a hierarchy of royal women with authority. We're going to be looking at the 1st century CE and Agrippina the Elder, the wife of Germanicus, who gave birth to 9 children, at least that we know, 6 of whom survived past infancy. One of her sons, of course, becomes the Emperor Caligula, and her daughter Agrippina becomes the wife of Emperor Claudius and mother of Nero. So we're looking at another very complicated family tree, but you know, such is life. According to the historian Tacitus, Agrippina's powerful fecundity is a source of fear to the Emperor Tiberius and a source of pride for herself. It showcases her innate Claudian arrogance. It is proof of this quality. In the Annals, Tacitus traces the vicissitudes of her life through 4 significant references to her fecundity, indeed more references to a single woman's ability to bear children than any other figure in its surviving literary corpus. The Emperor Tiberius and his mother Livia, so we have the dynasty enthroned on the Grand Camée. The Tiberius and Livia, seen at the center, persecute Agrippina, ensuring that she dies before witnessing her son Caligula ascend the imperial throne. And so we're going to be looking for the meaning of her motherhood amidst all of this, how it relates to this idea of power. In looking for this meaning amongst women in the ruling family in Rome, we're faced, of course, with gaps in language. There's no word for empress. There's no concept of a female princeps. And so there are going to be some gaps in meaning. We're attempting to recover an idea about what mothers in antiquity, considering the public roles of mothers, arguing for maternity as perhaps a symbol for the Augustan redefinition of the Roman patriarchy in the early years of the Principate. But how do I wonder, does the question of female agency then work with the concept of fertility and maternity and a celebration of Augustus and his descendants reconsidered and remembered in the text of Tacitus? So we're going to center on Agrippina, employing other imperial mothers as comparative figures. Although a source of power, I suggest that fecundity is also, of course, dangerous. It produces imperial rivals and has the potential to destroy the dynasty. The power of a royal woman's productive body poses an irresolvable challenge to the patriarchy, instilling fear and anxiety in ruling men. We'll begin with an image of a pregnant body just to establish or to remind ourselves, I think, of the dangers attendant upon a pregnant woman in this time. This is, of course, just one of many, many examples of votive statues depicting a pregnant woman. It would have been dedicated to a deity in hopes of a safe pregnancy and a safe birth. And there are just so many of these images that we can find from the Ptolemaic period in Egypt through the Roman period, among others. Although statistics are, of course, impossible to establish completely concretely, we know the process of childbirth is a fairly harrowing experience and could easily result in the deaths of mother, child, or both. Surviving past infancy and early childhood was at most a 50-50 chance. Royal marriages and children bound elite families together in fairly tenuous political or / domestic alliances. We might recall the death of Julius Caesar's daughter, Julia, during the birth of her child by Pompey. This marriage to Pompey bound the two men together as family and forced a reconciliation, but her death dissolves that bind, catalyzing further political military strife. Now, the image of a pregnant woman, of course, depends on this image of a distended womb. The child born from a mother can create and solidify alliances, but before birth, the womb provides a prospective image. It is hopeful, perhaps. It looks towards a future, but it also has a myriad of other meanings in ancient literature, and I'll point towards just a couple to complicate that idea. That in Lucan, we get Laelius, who pledges to bury a blade in his wife's pregnant body if Caesar asks, as proof of his loyalty. We have Agrippina the Younger's famous last words, to strike the belly, as an image of treachery. We have the womb as an image of fratricide with Polynices and Eteocles. We have the womb as an image of corruption in the Dialogus. The vices of the city are all but conceived in the mother's womb. We have an image of sycophancy, right? The Senate votes for a temple to fecundity just to honor Poppaea Sabina at the birth of her child by Nero. Of course, it is also an image of fertility, but I wanted to complicate that a little bit before we focus in on the Annales. So when we consider royal births and pregnancies, we need to always be even more perhaps forward-looking. So prospective images are pretty common. A royal mother with the child, the heir apparent, in which the mother gains prestige and a celebrated presence in official state-sponsored imagery due to her position as now a mother, not just consort of the ruler. Of course, it doesn't really work out for Messalina. These images we saw a little bit last time become very prominent under the Hellenistic queens, focusing, however, at the point at which this prospective image becomes reality. The child is not only born and raised, but becomes a ruler. And we looked a little bit last time at the archetypal couple as Arsinoe II and Ptolemy II, who ruled as a semi-divine pair in the 3rd century. I give just one example of a gold octadrachm featuring their parents, Ptolemy I and Berenike, on the obverse as the divine parents of the siblings Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II on the reverse. The legends read Theon of the gods and Adolphon, or of the siblings. These siblings, of course, did not have children, but their co-ruling image impacts those who comes later. The Jugate portraits of ruling couples and their parents suggest a clear transfer of power without clearly differentiating always between the roles of male and female rulers. We talked about some of these images, and I want to turn then to their reception and repetition by the Romans, which gets perhaps a little bit of a different or mixed, at least, review. The image of Jugate portraits or side-by-side portraits is repeated at the end of the 1st century by Antony with both Octavia and then Cleopatra. The image of Octavia coupled with Antony is one of her earliest public portraits. She and her husband are celebrated on this issue from Ephesus. The image of Antony and Cleopatra is perhaps more problematic for the Romans, as Antony, of course, abandoned this wife and his Roman identity to become the Dionysiac consort of the Egyptian queen. In the 1st century CE, Agrippina the Younger transformed this image. She appears on coin issues both as co-ruler of a semi-divine pair with her husband Claudius, as well as the partner, either facing off against or Jugate with Nero. This image presents an oppositional paradigm of those above. Here we have a mother in power with a son, an image that shows both the child fulfilling his potential as well as the mother claiming a role in his eventual rule. This quick catalog that I've suggested, from pregnancy to childbirth, mothers and infant sons to husband and wife, mother-son ruling pairs, establishes perhaps a roadmap from prospective imagery in pregnancy to ruling reality, as a woman is presented, at least on numismatic imagery, as a co-ruler or partner in power with a husband and then a son. The path is created from the moment a royal woman is pregnant, but of course that future is often overturned. Nevertheless, the implicit power attributed to a ruling woman who becomes pregnant, raising a son to achieve the imperial Roman throne, is visible in public imagery, providing a backdrop for the literature reflecting and commenting upon the unintentionally matrilinear Julio-Claudian dynasty from a point of historical remove. The images also depict a relationship between motherhood and power and the future-oriented nature of pregnancy, the idea that even while pregnant, a royal wife is already looking forward to the moment of her child's accession and the attendant authority it might or should or could grant her. The path is difficult but attainable, and she looks forward to being the mother of the ruler, perhaps even given the honorific title of Augusta, even before that ruler is born. The anticipation of this moment guides her every move, and I would argue that is particularly the case in Agrippina. On the other side of the coin, the male fear that emerges from the ability of women to reproduce or not produce heirs is very real and reflected in imagery and text. While motherhood is, of course, completely the purview of women, men still seek to control it. The Emperor Augustus, as we know, passed significant legislation that sought to promote the production of elite children and limit marriages that would not increase the numbers of elite issue. The Lex Julia de Maritandibus Ordinibus forbade marriages between the orders. The Lex Julia de Adulteriis Corcendis made adultery an act punishable almost like treason, including exile and loss of property. We should view these laws as a deliberate attempt by men in power to assert authority over the womb, the reproductive capabilities of women. The immediate response to this legislation was rejection, both by members of the equestrian class and Augustus's own family. The emperor famously exiled both his daughter Julia and granddaughter Julia on charges of adultery, even putting to death the child of the younger Julia, who was born in exile. He thereby asserted control over their reproductivity, including members of his family who might have risen to the highest position of women possible, that is, wife of a princeps. The populace responds by criticizing his harshness, but Augustus stands firm. Both Julias die in exile and are denied burial in the mausoleum of Augustus. This example illustrates the fear at the basis of women's reproductive power, that you can never perhaps be absolutely sure who the father of a child is. And we mentioned last time Augustus's daughter Julia joking in Macrobius's Saturnalia that she never took on a passenger unless the ship was full, implying that she never took a lover unless she was already pregnant with Agrippa's child. This legislation intended to combat this innate fear of paternity, rewarding those with 3 or more elite children, giving benefits to both parents for their successful issue. So while these two Julias become the ultimate failed models of the immoral legislation, Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder are his greatest success story. So let's go back to that family tree, just reminding ourselves. Aside from having 6 children survive to adulthood, their children were descended from both Livia and Augustus, and thus seemed the heirs apparent to the imperial throne. Tacitus, I would argue, has a fairly complicated relationship with Agrippina the Elder. In the annals, her husband Germanicus is a figure of the past, an image of a fading republic to which Rome will never return. Agrippina is a figure of the past and her Augustan ancestry, as well as a figure of the future, looking ahead to when either her husband or one of her children ascends the imperial throne. As Alina P. observes, Tacitus's women have a double position. They're marginal figures in history, but central to its ideology, responsible for the production of men for the state. Their emotional lives dominate his narrative, and they end up being some of the most memorable characters in his history. They thereby reflect a core binary in which the female body produces, whereas the male body becomes a weapon of destruction. Women in Tacitus reflect the marginalization of women within the patriarchy, even those among the ruling family, but Agrippina works against this by driving the narrative forward, transgressing expectations of gender, opposing the hypermasculine universes of Roman politics and the military. She walks the slender line between transgression and social acceptability, displaying exceptional mental fortitude without compromising her pudicitia, the sexual chastity at the basis of her moral evaluation. She's assessed in the annals on multiple levels based on her gendered performances as woman and productive mother, a manly matron performing a role not natural for members of her sex. Tacitus has quite a lot of trouble depicting her negotiation of both, and utilizes the idea of fecunditas, or fertility, to organize his complex, often ambiguous characterization. He refers to the fecunditas of a woman 7 times in our extant annals, and 4 of them describe Agrippina. I want to touch on each of these, as I think the particular word choice points towards a much larger theme in the Annales, lying at the center of Tacitus's commentary on the concept of female fecundity as a means to power, both female power or authority for the mother, and the premature or prospective power attributed to her child or children as potential heirs. First, a leading woman's fecundity is publicly known. In his account of the revolt in Germanicus's camp on the Rhine in 14 CE, Tacitus records that the officers feared for the wives and for Agrippina, urging the general to send his wife away to safety. Germanicus convinces a bold, reluctant Agrippina to leave, embracing her pregnant belly and their child Caligula, crying, and sending her away with a group of officers' wives. The appearance of the pitiful group and the sound of their wailing attracts the attention of the other men in the camp, who come out of their tents and lament the departure of the women for the land of an allied people. They're particularly concerned for Agrippina, a woman remarkable for her fecundity, her chastity, and her ancestry. In his text, the soldiers recognize her impressive fertility, ipsa insigni fecunditate, It implies that these common soldiers, have knowledge of her ability to produce children, as well as a knowledge that her ability is remarkable in some way. At this point, she already has 3 sons and will soon give birth again. As I mentioned, we have references to at least 9 children. Her physical ability to have children is thus famous, not only among those of her same status. In Tacitus's account, her departure helps catalyze the end of a mutiny. Not only is her ability to have children well known, but her presence as a woman has an undefinable power in the camp. The soldiers desire her return so strongly, they're really willing to resolve mutiny in order to expedite her continued presence among them. Her influence is based on ancestry and fecundity, the last which is a quality of woman. She employs her feminine qualities to assert masculine control, suggesting that power is defined not by sex, but by action. In his second reference to Agrippina's fertility, Tacitus establishes that there is a hierarchy of power implicit in a woman's ability to produce children. Agrippina has her character flaws, primarily arrogance, but the historian observes that she surpasses Livilla, the wife of Drusus, in both fertility and renown, fecunditate ac fama. The husbands of these women, Drusus and Germanicus, are implicit rivals for the imperial throne as potential successors to Tiberius. While the men are generally agreeable and don't exhibit animosity towards each other, their wives are set apart, and the comparison suggests that Germanicus is ahead of Drusus because of his wife. Drusus's wife herself will soon produce male twins, a rare occurrence indeed in Rome, and Tiberius will celebrate them excessively. Only 1 twin survives infancy, proving the fickleness of fortune and the swift ability of fertility to raise or lower a woman's position. This brings us to our third idea of women's power and a hierarchy created by a successful mother in comparison to others that can be challenged or altered due to the death of a child or the actions of the man with whom she is associated. For Agrippina, the death of Germanicus causes a swift change in fortune and represents the death of her own hopes to become the next emperor's wife. Germanicus is killed by poison, and in his dying breath, he begs his wife to tame her temper and display their children to the populace in order to gain sympathy. After his death, the populace mourns for the death of the Republic, as well as the altered fortunes of Agrippina and her children. More specifically, they regard her fertility as unlucky due to her change in status, infelici fecunditate. Her 6 children, who erstwhile posed as 6 potential heirs or wives of heirs to the imperial throne, are now all potential causes of grief, as Tiberius is essentially sure to persecute them and hurt Agrippina by proxy. And this is, of course, what happens to everyone except Caligula. While reproductive power lends authority to a ruling woman, in the Roman world of the Principate, that power depends upon the position, reputation, and survival of a husband. Female power is contingent upon so many factors, and the death of Germanicus vividly illustrates one of them, and even the populace knows that Agrippina's authority has taken a blow. In our final reference, we see that fecundity may be weaponized against a woman in the demise of Agrippina and her 2 eldest sons, Nero and Drusus. It has the impact or the ability to impact a woman's character. Tiberius's second in command, Sejanus, considers how to get rid of Agrippina and her children, noting her unassailable chastity, so we can't consider her an adulteress, unlike Livilla, who becomes his own paramour. The death of Livilla's husband, Drusus, seems to brighten the future of Germanicus's children, but Agrippina's ambition hastens their fall. Sejanus, who is responsible, of course, for Drusus's death, sees an opportunity. Poison is impossible as a means to murder Agrippina and all of her sons. So instead, Sejanus attacks her motherhood, attesting she's arrogant because of her fertility, employing the very superlative quality or positive quality of Roman women against her superbam fecunditate. Sejanus's ability to transform a positive quality, a physical capability that is likened to a virtue, into a vice is exceptional. And while we don't have time to break down all of the things that make Sejanus effective at controlling Tiberius, This ability to transform the meaning of words and attach negative connotations to positive qualities of womanhood provides an index of the extent to which Sejanus's moral failings contribute to and perhaps reflect a degradation in morality that Tacitus sees that increases towards the end of Tiberius's reign. After Livia dies, Tiberius charges Agrippina and her son Nero with treason. Agrippina is exiled and killed. And after her death, Tiberius mocks her, accusing her of a masculine desire to rule. His condemnation takes the place of a eulogy, and Agrippina disappears. So we have the idea that Tacitus's references to Agrippina's fecundity prove that an imperial Roman woman's fecundity was publicly known and may be celebrated by all levels of society. It could grant popular approval for one's own position and hope for one's children to succeed the emperor. It establishes a hierarchy amongst ruling women for the implicit heir, but that hierarchy can be challenged or quickly diminished depending on the situation. Indeed, fecundity can be weaponized by political opponents. The existence of too many potential heirs suggests a future of political strife, and the populace has to take sides. I'd like to point towards the last three references to fecundity that indicate its different types of failure. And we'll start with Agrippina the Younger. We know that fecundity can be a means to power, and we establish that in his paradigmatic portrait of Agrippina the Elder. But we see in her daughter, Agrippina the Younger, this is put to a different use. After the death of Messalina, Claudius searches for a new wife. Pallas promotes Agrippina as the mother of Nero, warning Claudius not to allow her to bring her son into another non-Julio-Claudian household. Vitellius uses her fertility in a speech before the Senate, advocating for the change to laws that will allow the marriage between an uncle and niece. Under Nero's reign, Poppaea Sabina cites her own fertility as a reason why she should become his next wife. She has no hope of marrying Nero while Agrippina and Octavia are alive and reproaches Nero daily, accusing him of being under Agrippina, his mother's control. Poppaea accomplishes her goals and becomes the mother of Nero's child Claudia. Upon the birth, a temple de fecunditas is vowed, but the infant dies within 4 months and the temple is likely never built. So on the other hand, both Agrippina and Poppaea's deaths offer a pointed commentary on the power of the womb or its failures. As Agrippina's murderers approach her, she declares to them, "Strike the womb," casting a miasma on the entire Julio-Claudian line in the process. Poppaea dies while pregnant with another child after Nero kicks her in the stomach in a chance fit of rage. She might have suffered a miscarriage and died as a result. Both of these women prove that the power inherent in the reproductive capabilities of women is fleeting and dangerous, even for women at the top. Poppaea cites her fertility as a reason for her authority and why she should be Nero's wife, but the death of her children proves that this can destroy dynasties and that fertility can lead to political strife. Death during pregnancy or after a miscarriage demonstrates that unofficial female political authority is fickle, connected to domestic life, not easily gained, but easily lost. Tacitus finds the very concept of hereditary dynasty inherently flawed due to this dependency on the reproductive capabilities of a female body. The dynasty, matrilinear by accident rather than design, is perhaps the foremost example of this concerning dependency. So although I'm not quite sure I've given a definition of power, I hope that investigating fecundity as a source and measure of power, that we're perhaps closer to a definition of at least one way female power is represented in imagery and text. And I will close it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very, very interesting talk. So before opening the floor for questions, I can see people clapping, so it was a very good talk. Very interesting, a lot of food for thoughts. Thank you also for moving between different time periods. That was very important. It made me think of a theoretical point that Beth made some times ago, that working on women in Hellenistic times, you come familiar with this concept that is the unit, the idea that mother son are a political unit. And so I think that could be applied for what you said today. I don't know how you could bend then this concept and your context, but yeah, to see that they work together as a political party, like political unit. Yeah. I don't know if you want to expand on this, or I can move to the first question that is from Timothy Howe, as you wish.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that that's a really helpful kind of framework to think through again, and especially with Agrippina, because she gets exiled with Nero, right? With her, Agrippina the elder and Nero the elder, they get exiled together. But then she has other sons, so it's interesting to think of like them as a unit. But then what happens if one son dies? Do you just kind of let's try the next one and the next one, but that's really helpful because I think, of course, with Agrippina the Younger and Nero, they do operate as a unit, especially in the first 5 years of his reign, and especially after she has Claudius killed.
Yeah. So first one is Timothy Howe.
Yeah, sorry I can't project my picture, but thanks, Caitlin. That was really interesting, and I see other people want to talk about fecundity, which I do too. But I'm curious. I've always been curious about Agrippina the Elder. And the way in which I wonder, is she somehow aware of her agency here and choosing to work within an Augustan system, maybe to invert what's going on with her mother, and at least the reception of her mother and her sister? Is she the one who's forging this fecundity?
That's it's such an interesting idea, because it works against Livia, right, who only has one son who survives, and it kind of tries to almost go back to Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, who had 12 kids. Obviously only 2 of them survived to adulthood, but I think there's a lot to think through what model she's trying to work with. If that's clear, because in some ways she's modeling herself on Livia. Obviously, she wants to be the mother of the next emperor, but I think she's trying to go back to a larger ideal in the world of the Republic. And I say that because at the death of, or at the funeral procession for Germanicus, the populace laments that she is the last specimen. She's the last kind of specimen of Republican morality, and also that she is the last true descent, the last female descendant of Augustus, which is of course false, because Julia is still alive. She's just in exile, but people have kind of forgotten about that. So she's working against those models of the 2 Julias. And then I think, I think there are 2 alternate choices, is whether she is trying to model herself on Livia, her direct predecessor, or if she's trying to go back to something a little bit further beyond. I'm not sure if that's clear, but yeah, I think she's working with a couple of different ideas there.
Yeah,
at least as Tacitus presents her.
Thank you.
I think there is one question from Alex.
Yeah, thanks so much for this, Caitlin, because I think in the Hellenistic realm, at least, I fall into the tendency of just thinking, reproductive fertility good, and then not really moving beyond that at all. And I think you've shown just how much is at stake here, especially in the Roman literary tradition. I'm asking about Messalina, but I think it's more the idea of, in Tacitus at least, the idea of an imperial woman as kind of embodying and representing the empire as a whole. So in the background of all of this, I kept thinking, wow, Messalina is kind of the antithesis of a lot of this. So I wonder if she is the threat to imperial legitimacy that Tacitus is looking at and then re-examining Agrippina, and whether you get a sense of fecundity, or even just the imperial woman's womb as representing the empire as a whole.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on Messalina, but I will share just 2. One, and this is, I'm not sure if this is going to come out right, but Messalina had a son and daughter by Claudius, so she kind of did her duty, right? She did her thing, and then she went to play, and that's not the right euphemism, but anyway, but then when she then goes away from Claudius's household and is going to marry Gaius Silius, part of his rationale is like, we should get married, but Britannicus will be in exactly the same position he was. Like, he'll still be the heir apparent, which is a little bit ludicrous, right? I mean, he won't be if unless then Silius becomes emperor. So there's kind of a disconnect there, that Silius says, if you get married, your son will still be the heir apparent. So we're still just doing the exact same thing, just with kind of an alternate dynasty introduced, with Silius's family rather than Claudius, rather than remaining within Claudius's household. I think on the second, on kind of a deeper level, there is in some scholarship the idea that, you know, the Rome is where the emperor is, right? Rome is defined where the emperor is, the emperor is the center of the empire. And I don't think that's entirely true, because I think Rome is, you know, more often the future of Rome is where the heir is. And on this level, at least the pregnancy level, it's wherever the consorts of the emperor, wherever her womb is, like, that's the future. So when Messalina moves to Silius's house and she moves her body physically to his house, I think that's a real threat and an idea that she is almost moving the imperial domus, right? Like, she's actually, you know, we're not on the Palatine. We are wherever I am, and my reproductive capabilities. And here I go trotting across the city to Silius's house. And so, yeah, I guess those would be my two thoughts. One is that we have this disconnect in at least Tacitus in Annals 11, where Britannicus is supposedly in exactly the same position as heir apparent, no matter who Messalina is sleeping with, or married to. And then secondly, that, you know, this idea of a woman during her years where she can be producing heirs, like, that's where the empire is. That's where the future of the empire lies.
That's fascinating. Thanks so much, Caitlin.
Thank you so much for this. I have Lloyd with a very brief, short question, but maybe he wants to.
Thanks so much. That was absolutely superb. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. I was really fascinated by the catalogue of different kind of womb types you gave, you know, and one of the ones that I liked when you said you started off with the hopeful womb, which I suppose, you know, lots of dynasties and individual women stake their futures, their lives on this. But I'm also thinking about the other sort of womb, I suppose, if you're on the other side of the couch, and that is the threatening womb. Mm-hmm. And how women's fecundity, of course, for other women within a dynasty or an opposing dynasty can be such a threat. And of course, you know, we're all familiar with Daniel Ogden, and we've all worked in our own ways on the idea of amphimetric dispute. But it starts long before any child is actually born, of course. You know, the minute that a woman can show that she's pregnant, the stakes are suddenly up again. And, you know, for you know, a secondary wife in a more polygynous society, or for a concubine or whatever, that symbol itself becomes incredibly threatening. I mean, to the point that, of course, that, you know, women have lost their lives over this too. So I thought it was a really interesting way to think about how we can approach the womb in many different dimensions. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think again, I probably have two. I have a lot of thoughts, but the two that I would point to is going beyond the idea of dynasty to look at the idea of enemies, right? So Tacitus doesn't talk too much about pregnant women, but the one is Agrippina when she's on the Rhine. The second is the wife of Arminius. So when Germanicus is up against Arminius, who's never named, I mean, Strabo calls her Thusnelda, but she's just called wife. So the wife of Arminius, when she is taken captive by the Romans, she's pregnant, right? So she, in Tacitus's text, so she's pregnant and she's like there looking at her womb as she's being led off by the Romans and a bunch of her family members. And Tacitus says that she has the mindset of her husband rather than her father, who had allied himself with the Romans. So she has that same idea of arrogance that I think Agrippina has, and the same idea of a threat, right? What if Arminius, who's responsible for the Teutoburg forest, Claudius, the disaster, what if he has a son who's just as disastrous for the Romans? So there's, so that threat is there on that level as well. And the only other pregnant person who's in the annals is Zenobia, the wife of Radamistus. And when they escape from the palace and they're being chased or whatever, she's also pregnant. And she says, dear husband of mine, just help me commit noble death by suicide, and then you can go on your way, because I'm, burdened by my quivering womb. And so he tries to kill her, and he escapes, and then is, killed by his father or whatever. Anyway, whereas she survives, and she's actually brought into the court of her husband's mortal enemy and raised and, kept in royal style. So there's this idea, and we don't know if she actually had a child or not, that survived. And so there's this idea like that this status is incredibly powerful, and can be threatening to the Romans if you're a foreigner. It can be threatening to other imperial family members if you're within the family, but it can also even be threatening to the father, who then, in the case of Radamistus, he escapes and his child does not. So that's so there's kind of a lot to unpack there.
And of course, mythology is full of that, isn't it? The threatening womb for Zeus or whoever it might be. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. Yeah.
So now we are going to have one question from Mr. Stephen Guerrero, which I will read to all of you because he can't turn on his microphone, like he has issues with mic. Then I have Sheila and Eran Almagro. So Mr. Guerrero was asking about the DNA testing. So because we have, of course, that's actually a question that comes up frequently when we talk about fertility. But I don't know if you have any thoughts to offer about what kind of evidence was offered in terms of legitimacy of parentage. There was could familial resemblance be used as a trace? Is it relevant in Tacitus?
It's a good question, and I haven't really thought of it from that angle before. I think that there is, of course, just the practice that the father has to accept the child, has to pick up the child as his, otherwise it will be exposed. So the father has to, or so-called father has to accept his role in paternity and pick up the child as his own. That's not a proof of legitimacy, but the idea of familial resemblance, we can think a little bit. We can think a lot about material culture and how you have, the Claudian forehead is pretty prominent. And then there's the idea that, depending on, at least in Agrippina the Younger's case, there is the argument that her sculpture actually, she looks more Claudian when she's married to Claudius, and then a little more Julian when when Nero takes over. So her forehead isn't quite as Claudian, and Nero, and she looks a little bit more like her son. That's neither here nor there, but I am trying to think of evidence for the phrase like, oh, Julia looks exactly like her dad, or something like that. And I can't think of that right off the bat, but that's a really interesting question that I'd have to think of more. Thanks.
Yeah, that comes up a lot, right? When we read about numismatic evidence, they often say, yeah, these are related because they look like they resemble each other on coins, but at the same time, would they do that on purpose, as you were saying? That's the problem. We don't know. Anyway, Sheila, you have another question, right? You made a point here.
I do. I see there are more questions too, so I won't go on too much then. Just on that point around familial resemblance, it just happened to be, because as one does, looking at Theocritus 17, and it speaks about Ptolemy the First and Berenike, and their marriage, and says, woman without affection, this is obviously not Berenike, is constantly thinking of another man and gives birth easily to children who bear no resemblance to their father. So there's sort of, in a nutshell, that issue. Caitlin, I really enjoyed this. That I want us, as we go forward with this, to really push the piece around fecundity and childbearing as a peculiarly female power, unavailable to men, and at times very threatening to men for, I think, a host of interesting subconscious and symbolic reasons. So I really like to do that. And just on the notion of prominent women who bear lots and lots of children, there are some later Ptolemaic and Ptolemaic Seleucid, by which I mean Ptolemaic women married into the Seleucid dynasty, that I would love to throw into the mix here, who had multiple births. And one in particular, I think of Cleopatra Tryphina, who is probably the least well-known of our Ptolemaic Seleucid queens. Very brief passage on her, but she had, like Agrippina, 6 children who survived to adulthood. All 5 of her sons became kings, which tells you something about the state of the Seleucid kingdom at that point. But I think it kind of says something about what our sources choose to tell us and choose not to tell us, because she's a cipher, she's a mystery. We have one passage about her in Justin, who loathes her, and yet we've got Agrippina, who's like at the core of the story of the Julio-Claudians. So there's just that interesting source thing. But I think there is that whole issue of fecundity as a female power we see it in the Hellenistic dynasties too. So I guess, I should let Caitlin respond, but as I say, I know there's more questions coming up. I'll stop talking.
No, not at all. I mean, you and I should caucus about more of those Ptolemaic Seleucid women, because I'm coming from a Tacitus perspective and kind of working back to the Hellenistic queens. So I'm happy for any and all information and further kind of thoughts on that. And I know we're pushing up against the clock, so maybe I'll leave it there for right now.
But sure, yeah. The advantage, can I just say, of a distributed conference? We have time.
It is. So it's 7:30, we should close, but I will indulge us with this other 2 questions, but if you need to go, don't worry, we understand that. So Iran, you have a last question, right?
Okay, thanks. It's more like thank you very much, Caitlin, for a very inspiring and interesting paper. My question is really a thought or an afterthought, really. First of all, I really like the idea of female fecundity, or presented as an equivalent to masculine ambition, and this is very interesting. So I was wondering about this image in later periods of Roman imperial history, because I think part of this notion as fecundity as a threat was because the Julio-Claudian dynasty, or really wasn't really a dynasty. The novelty of the experience of the royal family, the imperial family, so probably had much to do with that. And I was wondering whether this image changed later on when you had a different experience in the imperial family, and of course in the Nerva Antonine dynasty or Caesars, where you had this element did not really gain this importance at all. So this is the question, or a note for you
Yeah, Aaron, thank you so much. I love that note. I think I'll comment briefly on the Flavians and the Antonines, of course. for the Flavians, Vespasian comes in and he already has 2 grown sons.
Yes.
So the issue then is with Domitian, and Domitia, I think, has like 9 children. She gives birth a lot. It's just they don't
Yes.
survive. So I think it's still a concern, and then it kind of falls apart with the then with the 5 good emperors. It's kind of a different idea because you're adopting the best man.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so so I appreciate your point, and I think there's a lot to be said there, and both about the Julio-Claudian dynasty as a novelty and as a very unique situation in which you're trying to actively produce more
Yes.
people, as opposed to the Flavians that already have implicit heirs, and then the Antonines where you're more into adoption. But I appreciate the point, and I'll have to think more about that. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, we move to the last 2 questions. If you are okay with that, can I bother you? So Francis, you had a comment, right?
It's just a comment. I don't want to take time because I said everything I wanted to say in the comment. So it looks like Beth has her hand up too. So I don't want to take away time from actual questions.
He has a question. I didn't see the hand up. Sorry, Beth.
I felt a need to put the business of the dynastic women into the general context of fertility and pregnancy, and particularly for other periods anyway. There's lots of evidence that adult married women are kind of pregnant all the time unless they're nursing. They just often don't know, or the pregnancies don't go to term or whatever. So from the point of view of the norm and how much this stands out, you not only know how often they're pregnant in a number of these cases, or at least pregnant enough so you can tell, but you know how many of them survived, and it's good, not a problem, which it could definitely be if you were of even relatively speaking more modest means because of divvying things up. And then finally, lots of things for getting pregnant and childbearing, but not so many images, not just the Romans, of women being visibly pregnant, which has always fascinated me. It's very recently, I think a famous weather person on, I think, ABC, who's had many children and gets very visibly pregnant while she's doing it. It's really only in the last 20 years that we have allowed women to be visibly pregnant in public in a way that emphasizes it. So put these imperial women into the context of the wider society, and it is particularly striking and powerful. Anyway, I was fascinated.
No, thank you so much. I think because I'm on this search for images now of of pregnant females that aren't just votives, and it's really, really difficult. Nearly impossible. And especially for this period. And so yeah, yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that point.
So one last question from Christopher Starr, and then we close. Christopher, if you want, I can read the question. Okay.
That's fine. I realize it's getting on, so maybe I'll just turn it into a comment. Thank you very much, Caitlin, for that, and maybe we could email or something to talk about it if you want to know more. But these ideas seem to me already present in Octavia, right? Which is most likely before Tacitus. One, right, hoping that Nero has a child, right? This is most likely after the Julio-Claudian era has come to an end, but sort of wondering, well, what would have happened if Nero had a child either with Octavia or Poppaea? But right, there's this great celebration of Agrippina the Elder at the end of it. And I can't tell if it's ironic or not, but talking about how her children and how they were tokens of peace. And of course, well, one was, as you well pointed out, Caligula, and the other was Agrippina the younger, who appears as a ghost right in this. So just, as I said, more as a comment, but would feel free to say anything. Are you thinking about bringing in this play as well, or are you just sort of focusing on Tacitus?
I love the end of Octavia and the Pigneropacis. So my comment, and this is where you still bring in Tacitus, really, is that when Octavia gets sent into exile at the end of Annals 14, everyone laments that she's leaving, and they compare her leaving to the departure of Julia Livilla and the departure of Agrippina the Elder. And they're so sad even more because, her wedding day was likened to a funeral, but because Octavia didn't get to become a mom, right? Like, she is dying at the age of 20 before she had that experience, in direct contrast to Agrippina. So I think there's a certain irony in the Octavia, and then because you get that whole catalog of all of the horrible things that have been done to imperial women, getting sent into exile and killed, et cetera, et cetera. But you're right to point, I should think a little bit more about, the Pigneropacis, because the Pygnos idea gets utilized in the annals as well, a similar vocabulary.
Both is a pledge of empire as well. So it's interesting how that word can mean, right? Token of empire, the Pignora imperii, and then of course meaning child as well. So there's something. And didn't Nero first blame Octavia for sterility and then for having an abortion, right? In Tacitus. So again, this idea of, I've got to find a way to get rid of her. What's the worst thing that, right, a woman can do? And he sort of has two options and he uses them both.
Yeah, and neither of them make sense, but but there you go.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Christopher.
So much, Caitlin. To close, I'm just going to read, because I think we're all interested in this. I don't know if you noticed, Lloyd said that in the New Kingdom of Egypt, there are images of pregnant queens. So, and he made a couple of examples. So, well, with this, I thank you, all of you, for staying a bit longer with us. I hope you enjoyed the debate. I hope you gained some ideas, some insight. I'm sure many aspects are still open, and I'm not sure we will be able to answer all of the questions by the end of next year, actually. So I hope to see you again next time. The chair will be Edward Ensign. The speakers will be Brett Evans from Georgetown University with the Queen's Speech, Callimachus's Pieria, Aphrodite, and the political power of Ptolemaic queens. And then Eran, that was with us today also, who was going to talk about Esther, an Hellenistic queen. The day will be the 26th of November, so more or less a month from now, always 12 p.m. EST. Check your time zone, please, so not to get confused. So that was it. Thank you for coming. See you next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Caitlin. It was a great paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you for hosting.
Bye, Beth.
Bye-bye.
Bye.